Shall we just start over?
Yeah. It was so smooth last time. Obviously, this was going to happen.
This will be the blooper reel.
Yeah.
Rabbiting on, rabbiting on, rabbiting on, rabbiting on. Three rabbis, maybe a guest, doing what rabbis do best. Rabbiting, 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 rabbiting on, rabbiting on.
So whether you were with us last time or you're new to the podcast, it's really lovely to have you with us. I'm Rabbi Debbie Young-Summers, but this wouldn't be Rabbiting On if for some reason I wasn't also here with Rabbi Miriam Berger and Rabbi Robin Ashworth-Steen. But I am, and it is. It's lovely to see you all.
Lovely to be here. Lovely to be able to chat to you both. This week we're going to be talking about something that I'm sure will chime with a lot of people who are listening, but is also just a really significant part of what makes our synagogues run. But it's been so nice to hear from people who've been listening to the podcast and let us know what they felt. My husband did say it was a bit like having you both over for dinner, but there was no food and he couldn't get a word in edgeways. But hopefully...
He can bring his own snacks next time.
Exactly.
Yeah, it does feel like we've formed a little community already. I know we've all loved hearing the comments and questions from everybody and hearing, having you. I think one person shared they were listening over Shabbat lunch, which is just gorgeous that we're part of being part of your community and we're forming this together. And I know a lot of the comments and questions we've got we'll come back to in future episodes. We're really excited to continue those conversations with you and be part of this community. So if you do want to get in touch, you can always email media@rjuk.org, or you can tag us on Twitter with @reformmovement.
So how have you both been over the last couple of weeks since we were last chatting? What's been going on?
I'm still on a bit of a high from Eurovision. I love Eurovision. I so needed it. Just the glitz and the drama and the camp music. I just absolutely love it. And I watched it with my niece and nephew and 8-year-old son who take it really seriously. So it's really great.
There was a lot of really interesting Twitter storming around Eurovision. I noticed Michelle Visage, who Robin and I are big fans of through Drag Race, tweeted her support for loving the song from Israel, and the kind of pushback from people on social media just feeling like you can't say anything positive about Israel. That's not acceptable. That was hard, really interesting.
Not to mention the fact that it was a nil point kind of year for Britain. And I'm surprised we're even mentioning the words Eurovision after such a sorry state that we did.
He handled it really nicely, though.
Yeah, it was really true showmanship, wasn't it? He's just such a nice guy. And it was really sad. I was really upset about that. But I always am because my favourite never wins. It's just how it always happens, but that's fine.
I had a Shechechianu moment this week, having been able to go in and see my grandma for the first time in 14 months in a Jewish care home. And it was just one of those, weird moments of 14 months ago, I walked out of that room saying goodbye to her and my grandpa, never in a million years thinking it would be the last time I'd say anything to my grandpa. And I'd be walking back in, so many months later after kind of the world having changed so much, and yet the kind of nothing in that little world had changed. She was just sitting there on her own. It was sad and lovely all at the same time.
Wow. And were you able to be with her? Did you have to still physically distance and
I could
wear
give
masks?
her a hug.
Oh,
we
that's
were in masks,
beautiful.
but I could give her a hug. It was really lovely.
That's great.
I might have been getting a bit hug mad over the last couple of weeks. I've been asking permission, which I think is kind of a new thing that I wouldn't have done before. But it's probably a good practice to have, to ask people's permission before hugging them. But I'm very excited to be able to hug again. One of the hardest things of the last year has been, standing with mourners and not being able to reach out and hold them physically. Really, really hard.
And to do the celebratory moment. So we went to our first bar mitzvah party, a gathering of 30 in the garden on Saturday night. And so lovely to be able to do that kind of celebratory moment in person as well, and to be able to really see that milestone met again, which is really great.
I think you two are much more social butterflies than I am. Like, I've been fighting all the getting back into in-person stuff. I've been doing it very cautiously, but I'm also like super awkward, I realise. Like, the first in-person meeting I had, like, I spat over my plate when I was eating and talking, forgot how to do that. Like, we had to meet up in the park. I was like, how do I have small talk? I just felt so awkward. I'm sure it'll all come back to me, but I think I've got quite used to my own company and the manicured state that Zoom allows us to be, that you kind of stage everything, can mute if you don't want to hear a certain noise. It's been quite a journey for me in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, we've had a couple of young families events where I wished we still had the mute button. I'm going to lose my voice. Actually, one of the things that we really loved during the first lockdown locally was the launch of something called the Little Local Book Hub, and people basically creating libraries on their front drives where you could go and swap a few books, and it would be a kind of a trip out with the kids. We'd walk to the book hub, we'd swap some books over, we'd come home, they'd have something new to read. And the last couple of weeks I've been in touch with them, and I'm opening my own little book hub over half term next week. And that sense of just being able to do something really simple that isn't like, you know, I'm not going to necessarily benefit from it, but that sense of being able to volunteer locally and give something to the community has really excited me. I think we get so caught up in the Jewish world so much of the time. Just to be able to do something simple and local feels really lovely, which I hope leads us to our theme for this week, which is volunteering. Why do you guys think that people in your communities volunteer? Because volunteering is a really core part of running our communities and being present.
It's not really the core part. I mean, it's the only, we wouldn't exist, would we, if we didn't have volunteers? And it's kind of interesting, actually, because I'm not sure that we necessarily, or I don't necessarily think or describe the members of our community as being volunteers in that way. It's kind of interesting that, you know, for example, the charity that you just spoke about, or the grassroots organisation, very clearly I'd use the word volunteer there. Whereas in a community, I'd always say members of the community or congregants in that sense. But of course, it is all voluntary, apart from, in my case, we've got, you know, kind of three of us who work, but everyone else is voluntary. We would not survive. It wouldn't be if we weren't all together. And I think there's a whole host of reasons in a religious organisation why people volunteer. And I'm not even sure that people within the community could articulate why they do within a synagogue setting. It is just something that is natural, expected, and part of how they express their Judaism and their core identity.
Next week, the 1st to 7th of June, is the start of National Volunteers Week, which is why we're talking about volunteering. And apparently in 2018, 2019, 19.5 million people, that's about 36% of the UK population, volunteered through a group at least once during the year. And nearly 12 million people did so about once a month.
I wonder how that statistic will be different through the pandemic, because although people couldn't go out and into organisations so much, we certainly felt there was a huge surge of people saying, what can I do to help other people at this time, especially with people who suddenly realised they had a very different work-life balance and had time that they weren't used to having because of not having a commute, or because they were on furlough, or all sorts of things like that. And it'll be really interesting to see whether those people who stepped up during this pandemic year, that will continue in terms of volunteering. But as a community who's doing a rebuilding project at the moment, I'm totally fascinated by the Hindu temple in Neasden that was literally built by its members, and that very physical act of creating community. Now, I'm not sure that our synagogue would look quite the way we'd want it to if we were physically only using our members to build it. But there is something about the extraordinary experience and expertise that our volunteers bring to running Synagogue Life, that so much of what we do, if we had to pay for them as consultants doing what they do for Synagogue Life, we'd never be able to run. And being able to see them both in that kind of very professional and volunteer duality is really one of the many levels of layers of relationship that we work with.
That monetisation piece is quite interesting. Apparently, in 2017-18, the voluntary sector contributed £18.2 billion to the UK economy, which is nearly 1% of GDP. And like you said, we as communities couldn't function without volunteers, and without. I think we're also guided by volunteers, right? We need people to say, as a community, this is who we want to be, and I'm willing to put into this. If it's all professionally led, it's not a community, and it's that balance of community and professionalism that I think we strive for.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of find it interesting, that piece, that the monetization of, what it would be worth in the business world or whatever, because actually it's a completely different model, isn't it? So people who volunteer, or I'm thinking particularly in a synagogue context, and again, it's like, does the word volunteer quite work in that way? I don't know, because it's an act of service almost. It's a bit different. But I think that the beauty of volunteering is that you don't expect anything in return. You're doing it as a gift. You're doing it because, yes, it enhances your life and you can see that you're adding value to something, but you're not doing it to get anything back or valuing it in that way. And I think there's two parts to that. One, I think it's super empowering to be a volunteer. And I think in a world that you can feel quite powerless, and in a world that can feel, we hear about the rise of isolation, of mental health and all that stuff. You gain so much power and realise you have your own power by volunteering. And I do think that in synagogue context particularly, we're not very good at valuing it. We're not very good at saying, thank you so much for doing it. Honouring people's time and not expecting people just to kind of do what they've always done and give hours of their time. And I think that it can be there are some difficulties around volunteering in synagogue contexts, around power, around accountability, and around how you hold that space. It's not always as glamorous and kumbaya-y, if that's a word, the picture that's painted, really.
There is something about creating society as it could be. And I have a strong sense of that. For me, that's what Synagogue Life strives to do. It takes a kind of microcosm of community, of society, and says, if we were in relationship like this, how different would it be? And one of the things that we were able to do this year, because of the number of mental health professionals we've got in the community, is to be able to offer people one-to-one support, not as a kind of therapist or counsellor relationship, but as a mental health professional supporting a fellow member of the community through what's a difficult time. And when people are able to say, look, this is what I do, how can I use my skills to support the community? It is pretty extraordinary. And the legal advice and the financial advice, and all the Jewish knowledge and expertise that people bring into making our services beautiful is really something that, you're right, we definitely don't appreciate enough in terms of being able to thank and reward those people.
I think there are amazing people that have stepped up over the last year. We've had community circles where people have had 10 people to phone and keep an eye on and reach out to, and people who've been up for delivering things locally, and getting dinosaurs out to our kids and challahs out to people and daffodil deliveries, but I think there's also that challenge, as you said, Miriam, finding people's skills and using them focusedly and well. Quite often people will say, I'd really love to get involved, and it's trying to figure out the best way of empowering people to get involved, and sometimes people are just super excited and can get on with it, and other times it's how do we support people to find their place in volunteering in the community. And it's that in itself can be quite a lot of work, but it's so rewarding to have all these amazing skills in the communities that can be given. And that people are wanting. But also sometimes, people don't necessarily want to use what they do professionally in their volunteering time. They want to volunteer with something completely different. And I think there's a challenge of, okay, this is what you do professionally, it's what you're paid to do, therefore we shouldn't take advantage of something that you do professionally. And getting that balance right can be really tricky.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was just thinking, actually, that, often a kindergarten teacher won't want to go in and do early years teaching in a community. It's actually the last thing they might want to do. And I'm thinking of Charlotte Fisher, who is a teacher to so many of us in the rabbinate, who, says it's all about being in relationship with. The more we know the self-interest, the passions of our community members, the more likely we can then find something that they can give value to themselves and to the community in that as well. And I think that's crucial. And I love what you said, Miriam, about this, the spaces that we co-create, or like when we bring gatherings together, that we're holding part of the future in that space. I'm reading an amazing book by Peter Block about community, and he says that, like, you're creating whatever space you create, and however you create your community, you're creating a moment of the future. You're saying, here's the possibility. And I think that if we can construct in synagogues a world that is not about payment, is not about expectation or doing something by force, but people really doing it because they feel they can add value in a certain way, then we're setting up the world to be a really exciting place. If we make sure we have systems of accountability built in. So I think that, although it's a volunteer, and I think sometimes I can feel very like, oh, thank you so much for doing that. I'm so grateful. I can't believe you've given up your evening. Actually, it's also they're doing a role, and there's accountability built in, and time limited roles and all of that kind of stuff. Because I think it can get a bit complicated. And I think it could be complicated being a rabbi in all of this mix of working only really in a space that is volunteer led as well.
And of course, part of that challenge is volunteering is a fantastic way of giving to the community, but if we don't have members who also contribute financially, the professional part of the community will fall away, right? That it is a model that requires membership too, unless we start to rethink those financial models. But yeah, I think there's a really interesting power dynamic in what you're talking about, Robin, of the benefits of being managed as a professional rabbi by volunteers, getting those skills into the community, having all that positive energy. And there's a benefit to it changing every few years too, that there's fresh energy and energy, but there's also drawbacks of people having to kind of re-enter that space, learn how it all works. And there's also that challenge of when you are being managed by a volunteer who you are also the rabbi to, and might have walked through life's difficulties with, and will walk through life's difficulties with. There's a lot of kind of potentially conflicting pieces that are being held there, but also a huge amount of opportunity, because as you said, Robin, it's really all about relationships when we're in community.
And I do thrive on that sort of layered up relationship that is what community is all about. That actually it's not so much about defined roles at any one moment, but actually the layering of all of those different roles and all of the different personalities that are the interplay that actually I think give each community their own character and their own feel. Every synagogue, even within the Reform movement, really is very different and does have its own nature. And I'm sure part of that is those kind of layering of relationship and personalities into what otherwise could be job descriptions, and start kind of creating something that you could stamp out lots of versions of. So how you kind of walk that path, or really like dance that slightly strange dance that is being in those different relationships and watching the relationships ebb and flow as people come into different roles, and then that steps away from them, is part of what I love about community and the kind of the changing dynamic around that council table.
Yeah. And I love the way you described the layered like reality of what it is. Although I would say dance that dance rather than dance that dance, but that's just how we say things. And I think, so I'm always really interested in the tension between holding accountability and also appreciating the messiness and the beauty of what it is to be in various roles or just to be a person in community. I often will say in our community, we're the Jackson's Row family. And I've been reflecting on that and thinking, actually, there is something that can be that isn't helpful with that term, because actually we know from so many religious spaces that abuse happens primarily because in community spaces, we see them as being family spaces. We don't have, people come and take part because they feel that it's expected of them, or that the person, the rabbi, the vicar has asked them to do something, or there's a power dynamic there that we always hold by dint of our titles and our training. And I sometimes worry when I say family that actually that's too far to the extreme of what we're talking about of, it's just so-and-so, don't worry about them. And if someone complains, it's like, it's not a problem. Whereas actually there is a balance to be had of having those systems, regardless of whether you're a paid member or not a paid member, in place, but also allowing for that beauty of the messiness of relationships, the fluidity of roles, whatever it is. So I think it's something I'm always super aware of in terms of volunteering and how we hold our community spaces.
And there are really interesting examples of how volunteer-led organisations will suddenly have one of their leaders perhaps say something that's controversial or tricky. So, with Extinction Rebellion, which is a really volunteer-led organisation, and then suddenly one of the founders was saying things were potentially maybe a little bit anti-Semitic, and how does the whole organisation feel reflected in the words of their founders, as it were, when it's all volunteer-led, it's everyone putting their time in. There's no way you can get that mass of people to all agree in one way on things. And, it reminds me of Rabbi Loredana Klausner, who used to say that being in community is learning to be with people that we don't always agree with. It's not about learning to create little bubbles where we're all the same, but it's really about that relationship of I can live with someone who doesn't agree with everything I say and do, and we can still build something together based on those common goals.
And I think what's really important is that the moments where those times that we disagree are the moments where it can feel hard and tense. But what happens when we take those conversations into easier times? So, we've just had a few weeks of talking about Israel in a way that is difficult and hard for people and kind of polarizing. But if we leave those conversations only for times when everybody is anxious and kind of at their most fraught, that's where those conversations stay. But if we take those conversations into calmer times where we're actually able to say, we know how to have this conversation, we know that we hold different views, but how do we find the language and the way of communicating when times are quieter and when times are easier, so that we've got those conversations to kind of fall back on when there's, the moment that is tense, like you were describing, of kind of someone in a leadership role saying something that not everybody agrees with. I think we really have to learn in all spheres of synagogue life to have the difficult conversations and find the language to have them.
I was part of a project a number of years ago creating something called the Holy Land document, which sounds far grander than it is. But two vicars and myself and an Orthodox rabbi, two priests, worked for about 2 or 3 years on a dialogical response to something called the Kairos document, which was a Christian statement of support for the Palestinian cause, but that in places was incredibly I don't know, one-sided, tricky, not acknowledging the complexity of the situation. And working with these three other wonderful human beings on something that can be so difficult to talk about, particularly between religious communities, was so valuable personally. And initially we'd been asked to produce something that a whole bunch of people would be able to sign. And we said from the outset, we're never going to be able to produce something that everyone can sign, Jewish and Christian leaders, because it would say nothing. It would be so parep as to say nothing. So what we tried to do was create a document that could be the basis of a conversation between people. I'm not sure the document's gone very far. So actually, during the last crisis, it was those three people that I really kind of reached out to and said, there's a conversation that we need to be having when things aren't on fire. And I'm hoping that we will restart that conversation now that things have calmed down, we can't forget about it just because the bombs aren't falling. Now is the time for everyone to be having these conversations, but particularly, of course, on the ground in Israel and the West Bank, and allowing people to see each other's humanity so that these things can't continue to happen in cycles of violence.
Yeah, and I think it's so profound, really, what you've both been saying about living in the discomfort. If we can do that within community on a small local level, there is the potential of that really radiating out and changing the world. Like, it really is a moment of being able to, as you say, if we can see the difference and sit with the difference of everything that each person brings, live in that discomfort, we have such an opportunity. And I always think it's very interesting in community. So when there's a conflict, which arises all the time, when I came into the rabbinate, I was like, oh, this is such a distraction, people getting like what they're arguing with each other. And actually it was Rabbi Laura who said, that's the job. Like, the job actually is about how do you hold people who are in conflict. And often if we have a conflict in community, as all communities do, someone might say, well, I'm leaving then. I can't be in this space. And I'm like, no, you don't get to leave. This is where the work starts. Like, you're part of this. This is why it's interesting with like voluntary. Like, is it voluntary? Because to be Jewish for me is not a choice. Like, on some level it is, but on some level it's not. Whether Jew by birth or Jew by choice, I have to be Jewish. It's just what I am and what's expected. You don't get to leave. Actually, you have to be in the discomfort.
Has that worked, Robin? Have you stopped people leaving by telling them they're not allowed?
No. But I also haven't said it in that way. But I have, I to talk in this way, I often do, of saying there are always going to be people. And this is a way of us trying to test that and be with it and have conversation. I think when it can work well and you can bring people together maybe and kind of talk that through, there's such power in that. But no, as yet, that hasn't worked.
Although there is such a difference between, our communities are all in places where there are other synagogues locally, that people can say, well, I'm going to find a different community. Whereas in so much of the world, actually, your locals, your only synagogue is your synagogue. And I wonder if there isn't therefore naturally a difference at those moments of a disagreement, that actually there does feel more of this is all I've got.
That's something that's changed in some ways over the last year, that actually people have been able to go to synagogue anywhere they've wanted to. And it's one of the things that we had on an email into the podcast, talking about how accessible Zoom services have been and how important it was to not lose that. We've had people from all over the country, in fact all over the world, join our services. We've also had a new member who initially found a Reform service in South Africa. She hadn't grown up Reform and she really loved this service that she'd stumbled on Facebook, started going along, and then thought, hang on, I live in Edgware, this is a bit silly, and looked up her local synagogue and has now started coming to services and classes. And I think that ability to be open over the last year via Zoom has been astonishing. But I suppose, yes, we can keep those channels open, but there's something also sad about someone who maybe lives in Edgware wanting to be part of a community that's so far away that they'll never physically be able to connect. And having those local connections is also really important.
Yeah, I think so. And I completely agree that, you know, the accessibility, and it's kind of, you know, it's so not okay that for decades people with disabilities have been arguing that our, you know, spaces should be accessible, and it's like, you know, oh, I'm sorry, we can't do a live stream, it's too complicated, and all of a sudden, you know, everything is online and accessible. So that's super not okay, very frustrating. So yes, keeping it accessible. Our community has like changed because of that medium. But I really reflect, and I'm curious about what it is to be a consumer of Judaism online, that especially like people who watch our Facebook stream, not all of them, because quite a lot of them are active in community as well, but you're a consumer in that. And talking about volunteering, it's like, where's the duty and where's the investment? Like we talked about, you can invest financially, you can invest with your time, you're showing that it's a mutuality, you're in relationship. A synagogue isn't something that you're entitled to, it's not a service, it's not a charity that gives out, it is the mutuality. It's like the breath of relationship. It's just what it looks like. And I worry, you know, so I'm thinking, how do you do that? How do you build community where we don't then just become, you know, presenters of TV? How do we keep the beauty and like the energy of the accessibility and the growing community, and hold the duty as well as part of it? I'm really curious to where that's going to lead.
And something else that connects to that came in via email is the conversation around Jewish day schools, and how that ties in with what it means to be a community in a space where there are Jewish day schools, building relationships with those families who also have, or sometimes alternatively have, a sense of community at school, have a sense of their Judaism provided from school, the massive impact that's had on communities. So there was an email about Jewish day schools and what we all think, and we are going to return to that in a future episode. And of course, you know, there are lots of people who get involved in volunteering in the Jewish community through schools, you know, CST and security, through youth movements. There are so many different ways that people get involved in their community, and in life more broadly. And I suppose I really want us to just say a thank you to all those people in our communities and in the Jewish world broadly, and in the world broadly, who are just giving up their time to contribute and be
all
part
those
of the
people are
conversation.
coerced into volunteering roles that they've, as FRS call it, they've been Miriam'd. A big thank you for stepping up.
Then you can't say no to Miriam. So it has been lovely to be with all of you today. We are delighted that you can now subscribe to Rabbiting On via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and in fact, wherever you like to get your podcasts, you can probably find us there. All the information is available in the show notes and via our website. So until next time, it has been a pleasure to chat with you, and we will see you again in a couple of weeks.
Good to see you. Bye.